The colony ship Endurance drifted through the darkness of space like a metal seed carried on an invisible wind. It had been traveling for 60 years, its engines firing in long, slow burns that pushed it ever forward toward a distant star that the astronomers back on Earth had marked as promising. Inside the ship, 300 human beings slept in cryogenic pods, their bodies frozen at the edge of death, their dreams empty and cold. Commander Lisa Moore was the first to wake. The ship's computer had detected something unusual, and its programming required a human decision. Lisa opened her eyes to the dim blue light of the medical bay, her lungs burning as they drew their first breath in decades. She coughed, gasped, and felt the needles withdraw from her arms as the revival process completed. "Status report," she croaked, her voice rough from 60 years of silence. The computer's voice filled the room, calm and mechanical. "Commander Moore, we have entered a region of space that contains artificial structures. I am detecting energy signatures consistent with advanced technology. Recommend immediate assessment." Lisa forced herself to sit up. Her muscles ached. Her joints cracked. She felt like she had aged 100 years in a single moment, which in a way she had. The calendar on the wall told her it was the year 2847 by Earth reckoning, though Earth was now so far away that its light would take centuries to reach her. She pulled herself out of the pod and stumbled to the nearest console. What she saw made her forget her pain. They showed a ship, but calling it a ship was like calling a mountain a rock. It was enormous, easily 10 kilometers from bow to stern, its hull covered in patterns that glowed with soft blue light. It moved through space with a grace that seemed impossible for something so massive, turning and adjusting its course with the ease of a fish swimming through water. "What is that?" Lisa whispered. The computer had no answer, neither did Lisa, but she knew one thing for certain: humanity was not alone in the universe. She initiated the revival sequence for the rest of the senior crew. First Officer Blake was the next to wake, followed by Chief Engineer Martinez and Science Officer Henry Park. They gathered on the bridge, still shaking off the effects of their long sleep, and stared at the alien vessel on their screens. "It's beautiful," said. She was a practical woman, more interested in machines than aesthetics, but even she could appreciate the elegance of the alien design. "Look at those energy patterns. That's not fusion. That's not antimatter. I don't know what that is." Henry was already running calculations on his console. Based on its trajectory and speed, it's traveling at approximately 0.3 c, that's 30% of the speed of light, sustained. Our best engines can manage maybe 5% for short bursts. Turned to Lisa. "What do we do, Commander? Do we try to make contact?" Lisa watched the alien ship glide past. It hadn't changed course. It hadn't acknowledged their presence. Its sensors, whatever form they took, must have detected the Endurance, but it showed no interest in the tiny human vessel. "No," she said finally. "We watch, we learn. We don't announce ourselves until we know what we're dealing with." It was a decision that would shape humanity's future for centuries to come. Over the next several days, Lisa kept the crew on rotating shifts, monitoring the alien traffic that passed through the region. They counted dozens of ships, ranging from small craft barely larger than the Endurance to massive vessels that dwarfed even the first one they had seen. All of them ignored the human ship completely. "It's like we're invisible," said during one of their briefings. "They have to see us. Our fusion reactor is putting out enough radiation to light up their sensors, but they don't care." Had a theory. Maybe they see us, but they don't consider us worth investigating. Think about it from their perspective. They have ships that can travel at 30%. They have energy sources we can't even identify. And here we are, crawling through space in a metal tube powered by controlled explosions. We're probably not interesting enough to stop for. "That's somewhat insulting," Henry said with a slight smile. "It's also probably our best chance for survival," Lisa replied. "If they saw us as a threat, they might destroy us. If they saw us as valuable, they might capture us. But if they see us as irrelevant, they'll leave us alone. And that gives us time to figure out what we're dealing with. She ordered the crew to continue their observations while she reviewed their options. The Endurance had been bound for a planet in this system, a rocky world that long-range surveys had suggested might be habitable. Their mission was colonization, the establishment of a new human settlement far from the crowded worlds of the Sol system. That mission hadn't changed, even if everything else had. "We continue to our destination," she announced. "We establish our colony, we keep our heads down and our eyes open, and we prepare for the day when we might have to deal with whoever built those ships." The planet was called 442b in the old Earth catalogs, though the colonists would eventually give it a new name. It was a cold world, covered in ice and snow, with an atmosphere that was breathable but thin. Not exactly paradise, but the Endurance's crew had been selected for their ability to adapt to harsh conditions. They landed on a rocky plateau near the equator, where the temperatures were merely freezing rather than deadly. Lisa watched from the bridge as the crew began unloading their equipment, setting up the prefabricated habitats that would shelter them through the long nights. "First human footprints on an alien world," said, standing beside her. "Well, first human footprints on this particular alien world. Who knows how many others are out there?" Lisa nodded. Through the viewport, she could see the stars beginning to appear as the sun set. Somewhere out there, among those countless points of light, were the beings who had built those magnificent ships. She wondered what they were like, what they wanted, whether they would ever notice the tiny colony taking root on this frozen rock. She didn't know it then, but the answer to that last question was no. At least, not for a very long time. The first year on 442b was the hardest. The colonists struggled to grow food in the artificial greenhouses, battled equipment failures caused by the extreme cold, and dealt with the psychological strain of living in a small, isolated community on a hostile world. 3 people died, one from an accident during a construction project, one from a medical condition that the ship's limited facilities couldn't treat, and one from suicide. Lisa presided over each memorial service, speaking words of comfort that she wasn't sure she believed. She was tired, bone-deep tired, and sometimes at night she would stare at the ceiling of her quarters and wonder if they had made a terrible mistake coming here. But the colony survived. The greenhouses began producing reliable harvests. The habitats grew warmer and more comfortable. The colonists learned to work together, to support each other, to find joy in small victories. By the end of the second year, they had a population of 287, including the first baby born on the new world. They named her Hope, which Lisa thought was a bit on the nose but couldn't argue with. More importantly, they had learned a great deal about their neighbors. Henry Park had devoted himself to studying the alien traffic that continued to pass through the system. He had over 300 different ship designs, identified patterns in their movements, and even begun to decipher some of their communication signals. "They call themselves he told Lisa during one of their regular briefings. "At least, that's the closest approximation I can make to their language. They're the dominant species in this region of space, maybe the entire arm of the galaxy. They have an empire that spans hundreds of star systems. And the other ships we've seen, the ones with different designs. Client species, subject races, they seem to operate some kind of hierarchical system where they sit at the top and everyone else serves various functions below them." Henry pulled up a chart on his display. "I've identified at least 40 different species so far, each with their own role in the empire. Some are warriors, some are workers, some seem to be scientists or administrators." Lisa studied the chart. "And us, where do we fit in?" "That's the interesting part. We don't. As far as I can tell, they don't even have a category for us. We're too primitive to be a threat, too small to be useful, and too isolated to be worth investigating. We're basically beneath their notice. So we're safe." Henry hesitated. For now. But empires don't stay static forever. Sooner or later, someone's going to take a closer look at this planet. We need to be ready for that day. Lisa agreed. She began implementing new protocols designed to keep the colony hidden from casual observation. They limited their radio transmissions, shielded their power signatures, and built their structures to blend in with the natural terrain. They weren't invisible, but they were inconspicuous, and for the moment, that was enough. Years passed. The colony grew. Children were born, lived, and had children of their own. Lisa Moore grew old and eventually died, passing her command to Blake, who passed it in turn to a younger generation who had never known Earth. Through it all, the hegemony continued to ignore them. Grace was born in the year 2891, 44 years after the Endurance first landed on 442b. She never met Commander Moore, who died before she was born, but she grew up hearing stories about the woman who had led their people to this frozen world. Grace was a farmer, or as close to a farmer as you could be in a place where nothing grew outdoors. She worked in the agricultural domes that provided food for the colony, tending the crops that had been carefully modified to thrive under artificial light. It was hard work, but she loved it. There was something deeply satisfying about nurturing life in a place where life had no natural right to exist. By the time she was 30, Grace had become the colony's leading expert on cold-weather agriculture. She had developed new strains of wheat that could survive even if the heating systems failed temporarily. She had figured out how to grow tomatoes that tasted almost like the ones in the old Earth records. She had even started experimenting with native organisms, trying to find ways to integrate them into the colony's food supply. One morning, while she was checking the moisture levels in her greenhouse, a young man named Daniel came to visit. Daniel was a journalist of sorts, one of a small group of people who had taken it upon themselves to document the colony's history and development. He carried a recording device and a notepad, and he had a habit of asking questions that made people think. "I'm working on a story about how we've adapted to this place," he explained, pulling up a chair beside one of Grace's planting beds. "The original colonists came here with certain expectations, certain technologies, certain ways of doing things, but we've changed a lot since then. I'm trying to understand how and why." Grace wiped her hands on her apron and sat down across from him. "What do you want to know?" "Let's start with the basics. The food we eat today, how different is it from what the original colonists brought with them?" Grace thought about it. Very different. The seed stocks they brought were designed for Earth conditions, or at least conditions similar to Earth. But 442b isn't Earth. The light is different. The day-night cycle is different. Even the gravity is slightly different. We had to adapt everything. She gestured at the plants around them. "These tomatoes, for example, the original strain would have died in a week here. The light from our artificial suns doesn't have the right spectrum, so we bred new varieties, generation after generation, selecting for the ones that could tolerate the conditions. Now we have tomatoes that would probably die if you tried to grow them on Earth, but they thrive here." Daniel nodded, making notes. "And the native organisms you mentioned, I've heard you've been working with those." "Carefully," Grace said. "Very carefully. The microbes in the soil here are completely alien to us. Some of them are compatible with Earth life, some of them aren't, and some of them are compatible in ways that are actually dangerous. But I've found a few species that we can work with. There's a type of fungus that helps break down organic matter, makes it easier for our plants to absorb nutrients. I've been introducing it to some of the newer greenhouses." "Isn't that risky, mixing alien biology with our own?" Grace smiled. "Everything we do here is risky. They could show up tomorrow and decide to wipe us out. The heating system could fail and freeze us all. A new disease could emerge from the native ecosystem and kill half the colony. We live with risk every day. My job is to make sure we have enough food to survive whatever happens." Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "Do you ever think about them? I mean." Sometimes. When I was a girl, I used to have nightmares about their ships appearing in the sky, blotting out the sun. But as I got older, I realized that they're not interested in us. We're too small, too weak, too primitive. They have a whole galaxy to worry about. Why would they bother with a few hundred farmers on a frozen rock? A few thousand now, Daniel corrected. The population passed 5,000 last month. Grace raised an eyebrow. Really? I hadn't heard. It's true, and that's not counting the other colonies. Now Grace was surprised. Other colonies. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes bright with the excitement of someone sharing important news. You haven't been following the Council reports, have you? Over the past few decades, other ships have arrived from Earth. Colony vessels like the Endurance, following the same route. Some of them have settled here, but others have moved on to different worlds. There are at least a dozen human settlements now, scattered across this region of space. Grace sat back, trying to process this information. She had spent so many years focused on her work, on the day-to-day challenges of feeding the colony, that she had lost sight of the bigger picture. Humanity wasn't just surviving on 442b. It was spreading, growing, establishing itself in the shadow of the hegemony. And they still don't notice us? She asked. Apparently not, or if they do, they don't care. We're still too primitive to matter. Grace looked out the window of her greenhouse at the frozen landscape beyond. The sun was setting, painting the ice fields in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful in its harsh way. This was her home, the only home she had ever known, but it was also just one small part of something larger. Maybe that's a good thing, she said finally. Being too primitive to matter, it gives us time to grow. The colony on 442b continued to develop over the following years. New domes were constructed, new technologies were developed, and new generations were born who had never known anything but this frozen world. They built schools and hospitals, workshops and laboratories. They created art and music, told stories and wrote histories. They became, in every sense that mattered, a civilization. But they were not alone. Other human colonies were developing in parallel, each one adapting to its own unique environment. On a world called Seven, settlers had learned to farm in the harsh radiation of a red dwarf star. On a moon orbiting a gas giant, engineers had built floating cities that harvested hydrogen from the planet's atmosphere. On an asteroid in the outer reaches of a distant system, miners had carved out a home in the rock itself, living in tunnels that stretched for kilometers beneath the surface. These colonies had limited contact with each other. The distances were too great for regular communication, and the ships that traveled between them were slow and rare. But they shared a common heritage, a common origin, and a common determination to survive in a universe that had no place for them. And still they ignored them. Grant was the captain of the trading vessel Lucky Strike, one of a new generation of ships that humanity had built in the century since first arriving in hegemony space. The Lucky Strike was faster and more efficient than the old colony ships, capable of traveling between systems in months rather than decades. It wasn't as impressive as a cruiser, but it could go places they didn't bother with, which suited just fine. He was sitting in his cabin, reviewing the manifest for their next voyage, when his first officer knocked on the door. "Come in, Sophie," he called. Sophie Turner entered, holding a tablet in her hands. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, and she had been with for 10 years. He trusted her with his life. "We've received a request from the colony," she said, handing him the tablet. "They want us to deliver a shipment of medical supplies and pick up a cargo of agricultural products. Standard run. Scan the details, payment. Credits and trade goods. Plus they're offering a bonus if we can make it in under 3 months." "We can do that. Tell them we're on our way." Sophie nodded but didn't leave, looked up at her. "Something else. There's a rumor going around the station. I thought you should know." "What kind of rumor?" Sophie hesitated. People are saying that they have started taking notice of us, that there's been increased surveillance in some of the outer systems, that they're asking questions about the human presence. Felt a chill run down his spine, but he kept his expression calm. Rumors, that's all they are. Maybe, but we've been lucky for a long time, Captain. Over 100 years, and they've never once interfered with us. That kind of luck doesn't last forever. Was quiet for a moment. Sophie was right, of course. They had all known, deep down, that this day would come eventually. The empire was vast, but it wasn't infinite. Sooner or later, someone in authority was going to notice the growing human presence and decide to do something about it. "What do you think we should do?" he asked. "I think we should keep doing what we've always done. Trade, travel, build, but we should also be ready for the day when things change. We need contingency plans, escape routes, places to hide if it comes to that." Nodded slowly. "I'll talk to the other captains when we reach, see if they've heard the same rumors. In the meantime, we stay alert and we keep our heads down. And if they do come for us..." Looked out the viewport at the stars. Somewhere out there, among those countless points of light, was an empire that had ruled this part of the galaxy for 11,000 years. An empire that saw humanity as nothing more than insects crawling in the dust at its feet. "Then we show them that insects can bite," he said. The Lucky Strike departed 3 hours later, its engines firing with a steady blue glow as it accelerated toward the distant point of light that was sun. Stood on the bridge, watching the stars stream past, and thought about the future. 100 years ago, Commander Lisa Moore had made a choice. She had chosen to hide, to watch, to learn, rather than announcing humanity's presence to the galaxy. That choice had given her people time to grow, to adapt, to establish themselves in the forgotten corners of an ancient empire. But time was running out. The galaxy was getting smaller, and humanity was getting harder to ignore. Didn't know what the future would bring. None of them did. But he knew one thing for certain: whatever happened, humanity would face it together. They had come too far, sacrificed too much to give up now. The Lucky Strike flew on through the darkness, a tiny spark of light in an infinite void. Behind it, across dozens of worlds, millions of human beings lived their lives, raised their children, and looked up at the stars with hope and determination. They were small, they were weak, they were primitive by the standards of the great powers that ruled the galaxy. But they were human, and humans had a way of surprising everyone, even themselves. The journey took 2.5 months. Spent most of that time reviewing reports from other captains, trying to piece together what was really happening in hegemony space. The rumors Sophie had mentioned were widespread, but the details were vague and contradictory. Some people said they were mobilizing fleets. Others said they were just conducting routine surveys. A few optimists even suggested that the hegemony was preparing to offer humanity official recognition. Didn't believe any of it. In his experience, when an empire started paying attention to you, it was rarely good news. They arrived on a cold morning, the ship settling onto the landing pad with a gentle thump. Watched through the viewport as the ground crew approached, their breath visible in the frigid air. The colony had grown since his last visit. New domes dotted the landscape, connected by covered walkways that kept out the wind and snow. He met with the colony's council that afternoon, delivering the medical supplies and collecting the agricultural cargo. The council members were friendly but distracted, their minds clearly on other matters. Understood. Everyone was worried about the same thing. After the official business was concluded, he asked to speak with Grace. He had heard about her work with alien biology and wanted to learn more. The council directed him to her greenhouse, a large dome on the eastern edge of the settlement. He found her elbow-deep in soil, her hands covered in dark earth and her face marked with concentration. She looked up when he entered, brushed a strand of gray hair from her eyes, and smiled. "Captain Grant, I heard you were in town, looking for tomatoes." "Information, actually. I've been hearing rumors about and I'm trying to figure out what's really going on." Grace wiped her hands on her apron and gestured to a nearby chair. "Sit down. I'll tell you what I know." They talked for hours. Grace told him about her decades of work, about the slow process of adapting Earth life to alien conditions. She told him about the other colonies she had visited, about the different approaches they had taken to survival. She told him about her fears for the future and her hopes as well. "We've been invisible for so long," she said. "Sometimes I wonder if we've been fooling ourselves, if they have known about us all along and just haven't bothered to do anything." "You think they're that arrogant?" "I think they're that old. Their empire has existed for 11,000 years. To them, a century is nothing, a blink of an eye. They might have noticed us decades ago and simply decided to deal with us later when they got around to it. Considered this, and now they're getting around to it. Maybe, or maybe nothing's changed and we're all worrying for no reason." Grace shrugged. "Either way, there's nothing we can do about it except keep living our lives, keep growing, keep adapting. That's what we're good at." "And if they come for us?" Grace's eyes hardened. "Then we make them regret it." Left the next day, his hold full of vegetables and his mind full of questions. He spent the return journey thinking about what Grace had said, about the nature of empires and the resilience of humans. By the time he reached his home station, he had come to a decision. He would keep trading. He would keep building connections between the scattered human colonies. He would keep doing what he had always done. But he would also start preparing for the day when things changed. He would stockpile supplies, establish hidden refuges, create networks of communication that could survive even if the main channels were disrupted. He would hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Because that was what humans did. That was what they had always done. And that was how they would survive whatever the future had in store. The years continued to pass. The human population grew. New colonies were established. New technologies developed. New alliances formed. And through it all, the hegemony continued to rule the stars, ancient and eternal, its attention focused on matters far beyond the concerns of a primitive species scratching out an existence on the fringes of its domain. But things were changing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance of power was shifting. Humanity was becoming something that even they would eventually have to acknowledge. They just didn't know it yet. On a frozen world in the outer reaches of hegemony space, a woman named Grace tended her garden and dreamed of a future where her descendants would stand among the stars as equals. On a trading vessel sailing between systems, a man named Grant calculated routes and pondered strategies for survival. On a dozen other worlds, millions of humans lived and worked and hoped, each one a thread in a tapestry that was slowly, steadily being woven across the galaxy. They were small, they were insignificant, they were barely perceived. But they were growing, and one day the universe would have no choice but to take notice. The story of humanity's rise was just beginning. On the bridge of the Endurance, now a historical monument preserved in the center of the colony, a plaque commemorated the words that Commander Lisa Moore had spoken on the day they first encountered the "We watch, we learn, we don't announce ourselves until we know what we're dealing with." 100 years later, her descendants were still watching and learning. But they were also building, creating, establishing themselves in every corner of space that the hegemony had forgotten. They had taken Lisa's caution and combined it with their own determination, their own creativity, their own refusal to accept that their place in the universe was fixed. They had classified them as Category 7, suitable only for manual labor in hazardous environments. They had filed humanity away in a bureaucratic queue and forgotten about them. That was their first mistake. It would not be their last.